What if the man you bought to torture, the orc who killed your husband, was the only one who ever tried to save him? An elite elf widow. A slave purchased for revenge. A secret buried so deep it shatters the very bones of everything she thought she knew. Lady Arwen of House Etherin had a plan. It was cold, precise, and merciless, much like she had trained herself to be over the last year of grief. She would buy Gorzid, the orc gladiator who had stolen her husband's life in front of a cheering crowd. She would cage him, strip him of dignity, and watch him unravel the way she had unraveled in the dark silence of her manor every night since Theron's death. Then, when there was nothing left of him, she would end it. It was a perfect plan, right up until the moment it destroyed her instead. Chapter 1. The Purchase. The air in the underpits of Eldoria tasted like copper and despair. The crystal city above was all soaring spires and luminous archways, all polished grace and silver song, and beneath it, this. The rot underneath the jewel. The blood that paid for the beauty. Lady Arwen moved through the torchlit corridor with the stillness of a woman who had decided. Grief had done that to her. Burned away everything soft and uncertain. Left behind something hard and glass-bright and very, very sharp. Her handmaiden Sarah trailed 3 steps behind, as she always did, her face carefully neutral. Down below, on the blood-soaked sands of the gladiatorial arena, the orc stood. Gorzid. Even at this distance, from the private viewing gallery where coin bought privacy and silence, he was enormous. Green skin mapped with the white ridges of old scars. Arms like siege weapons. A jaw set in a line so rigid it looked carved from stone. He had just finished a bout, 3 opponents, none of them standing, and he hadn't even bothered to wipe the blood from his knuckles. He simply stood in the center of the sand and waited, as though the world owed him nothing and he expected nothing from it. Arwen had expected a monster. She had needed him to be a monster. She studied him for a long, silent moment. Then she turned to the pitmaster beside her, a soft, sweating elf with 2 mini rings on his fingers, and said, in a voice like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath, "Name your price." The number he gave her was, as she had anticipated, absurdly low for a gladiator of Gorzid's reputation. She paid it without negotiating. Negotiating would have suggested she cared about the coin. She didn't. She cared about what the coin bought. The chains they put on him were elven wrought, thin as silk, strong as mountains, and laced with a slow-acting suppression enchantment that would drain his strength over time. The iron collar around his neck pulsed faintly blue. He let them put it on him without resistance, which she found, against her will, slightly unnerving. She had expected rage. Snarling. The thrashing of a trapped animal. Instead, he looked at her. His eyes were the deep amber brown of old heartwood, and they held no fear whatsoever. Just a weariness so profound it seemed almost geological, and beneath it, not contempt, as she had assumed, but something closer to recognition. As though he had been waiting for someone like her. As though he had known she was coming. It infuriated her more than hatred would have. "Take him to the estate," she said, and did not look at him again. That night, Gorzid was installed in the lower chambers of Arwen's manor, a suite of rooms she had specially prepared. Not a dungeon, exactly. She was too intelligent for that. A dungeon implied she intended to break his body, and that would take too long and give him too simple a target for his endurance. No, the rooms were clean, well-lit, and utterly silent. The walls were white. There was a cot, a bucket, and nothing else. No color, no texture, no stimulation of any kind. The window, if you could call it that, was a thin horizontal slit near the ceiling that showed nothing but a strip of sky. Sensory deprivation. Solitude. And her visits. She planned it meticulously. Every morning, she would come to him and speak. Not shout, not threaten, speak. Softly. She would describe her husband in loving detail. His laugh, his hands, the way he had looked at her across a dining table. She would remind Gorzid, in intimate, unhurried sentences, exactly what he had taken from the world. She would do it until he broke. She came the next morning. He sat on the cot. He listened. He said nothing. She came again. And again. He endured it all with a silence so complete it felt like a physical substance. A wall. A mountain. No matter what she said, no matter how precisely she wielded her grief as a weapon, the wall simply absorbed it. He didn't smirk. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look away. He just watched her with those unreadable amber eyes. And the worst part, the part that followed her up the stairs and into her cold, canopied bed every night, was that they didn't look like the eyes of a killer. They looked like the eyes of a man carrying something very heavy, very alone. Chapter 2. The Ledger. Weeks collapsed into a month. The rhythm of their days became something neither of them had names for. Captor and prisoner locked in a ritual that was slowly, imperceptibly, changing shape. Arwen told herself she was still in control. She told herself the slight alterations in Gorzid's rations, the occasional piece of fruit slipped onto the tray alongside the dry bread, the slightly warmer water in winter, were tactical decisions. Keeping the asset alive, sustaining him long enough for the true purpose. She told herself she did not notice how his posture changed when she entered the room, from braced for impact to something more like stillness, as though her presence, even at its most hostile, had become a kind of anchor. She told herself she did not notice any of that. She was lying. The crack in everything began on a rainy evening when she couldn't sleep. The manor was full of the sounds of rain against crystal, a lovely sound, she had once thought. Theron had loved it, and she found herself, as she sometimes did against her will, walking the corridors of the East Wing. The places she didn't go, past the door to his dressing room, past the sealed portrait gallery, and then, before she knew she had made the decision, into his study. She had not been inside since the funeral. It was exactly as he had left it, because she had given strict instructions that nothing was to be touched. His quill lay at an angle on the blotter. A glass of something had evaporated and left a ring on the desk. His books stood in the order he had arranged them, his dog-eared pages marking thoughts he would never return to. Arwen stood in the center of the room for a long time, not moving, breathing carefully. Then, because she was a woman who had always been unable to leave well enough alone, she began to move through the room. Slowly, her fingers trailing across the spines of his books, the edge of his desk, the lid of the heavy cedar chest in the corner that held his dress uniforms. She almost didn't check the bottom. There was no reason to. She had inventoried his estate a dozen times with the solicitors, cataloged every asset and liability, read every letter she could find. But her fingers found a seam in the cedar that didn't match the grain, and something old and instinctive made her press it. The false bottom lifted with a soft click. Inside, a small ledger, bound in dark leather, and a sealed letter. Later, she would not be able to remember sitting down. She only knew that by the time she had finished reading, she was on the floor, her back against the cedar chest, the ledger in her lap, and her hands completely still. Outside, the rain hammered the windows. Inside, the world had ended. The ledger was meticulous. Theron had always been meticulous. She had admired that, once. Payments to arena officials. A substantial sum to a poison runner known to operate in the underpits. Detailed records of a gladiator named Cor the Blunt, known for fighting dirty, who had been paid to weaken Gorzid 2 nights before the duel. Not enough to show, just enough to slow. And then the letter. She recognized his handwriting immediately. She had loved his handwriting once. The elegant backward slant of a man who had been schooled in classical elven calligraphy. She had kept his letters tied in ribbon for years. She read it twice, to make sure she understood. Then she read it a third time. The debts were old. She had not known how old. Gambling, mostly, the kind that started as entertainment and became compulsion and ended as catastrophe. He owed money to people who did not accept the kind of installment payments his estate could generate. The kind of people who collected in different currencies. He had, by his own account, exhausted every legitimate option. The estate was over-leveraged. His political connections had dried up. His family would not cover him again. And so, he had arranged it all. A duel of honor. Oh, how that phrase rang hollow now, staged as a point of pride. An elven lord defending his name against the insult of an orc. He had chosen Gorzid specifically, the most famous gladiator in the pits, which meant the highest odds, which meant his associates had placed very large bets on the outcome. But the outcome required Gorzid to win. And Gorzid, the letter revealed, had not been given a choice. They had taken 3 members of his clan, an elder, a young female warrior, and a child, from the labor camp outside the city walls where his people were held under an old indentured labor decree. A discreet arrangement. If Gorzid killed Theron cleanly and professionally in the arena, they would be released. If he refused, or if he lost, they would not. It was, the letter concluded, a regrettable necessity. Theron had written this in the same careful hand he used to pen her love letters. A regrettable necessity. He wanted to be remembered well. He wanted her to have the insurance payout, the hero widow's pension, the clean story. He wanted his name restored by a convenient death. He had never once, in the entire letter, mentioned Gorzid by name. The ledger slipped from Arwen's fingers. She sat in the dark for a very long time. Then she stood up, straightened her robe, and walked down to the dungeons. Not with cold precision this time. With something that felt like the aftermath of an earthquake, the strange, terrifying calm that comes when the shaking stops and you realize the entire landscape has changed. What would you do if you found out your entire world was built on a lie? The woman who came down those stairs was not the same woman who had gone up them. Something had broken open in her, but what grows in a wound like that? Vengeance, or something else entirely? Leave your thoughts below. Chapter 3, The Confession. The tray she carried was different this time. Warm lamb stew, fragrant with herbs. Fresh bread, still soft. A flask of good wine, the kind she used to serve at dinner parties in another lifetime. A small clay pot of healing salve, and a roll of clean linen. She realized as she descended, been feeding him like a prisoner for a month. She had been so focused on the architecture of his suffering that she had not acknowledged the simple, shameful fact. His wounds from the arena had never been properly treated. She had let them fester, half deliberately, as another layer of slow punishment. Some of them, she now knew, must be infected. The door at the bottom of the stairs was ironwood, inlaid with suppression sigils. She unlocked it herself, as she always did. She had never given anyone else the key, and stepped inside. He was sitting on the cot, as he always was. He tensed when the door opened, which he always did, coiling into a readiness that even a month of deliberate weakening and enchanted chains had not fully extinguished. It was not defiance, she understood now. It was survival. The deep-coated vigilance of a man who had spent years in arenas where a door opening could mean anything. She set the tray on the floor between them. She knelt, and reached for the lock on his chains. He flinched back. Hard. His wrists jerked away, and something complicated and fast moved across his face. Suspicion and confusion and the ghost of something that might have been fear, which she found hurt her more than his contempt ever had. I'm not, she stopped. Started again. Her voice did something she had not permitted it to do in over a year. It cracked. He rigged the fight. My husband. He made you do it. All of it. He set everything up so that you had no choice. Gorzid went absolutely still. She worked the lock. Her hands weren't steady. The chains fell away from his wrists, leaving dark marks in the green skin beneath, and she wanted to touch them. Wanted to press her palms against those marks as though she could undo a month of her own making. But she didn't. I found the ledger tonight, she said. And the letter. I know about your clan. The 3 he had taken to ensure. She stopped again. Breathed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't know before. I'm sorry I didn't. The words ran out. For a long moment, Gorzid said nothing. He looked at the tray of food. He looked at the salve. He looked at her. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse, and it carried the accent of the mountain clans. Rounded consonants. Breath on the vowels like wind through stone passes. I tried to spare him, he said. In the arena. When I had the opening, I hesitated. I gave him time to yield. A pause. He looked at me, and he smiled. He was relieved. He had been waiting for me to do it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Arwen had ever heard. She opened the salve. She began, carefully, to clean the wound on his forearm where an old cut had indeed gone red at the edges. He watched her do it without pulling away. The first time she had touched him, that was not the clinical checking of his enchanted collar. He talked, slowly at first, then with growing steadiness, the way a dam releases when a single stone shifts. He told her about the mountains he came from, the boulderfish range, where the air was thin and cold and tasted of pine and altitude, where his clan had lived for generations in the holds carved directly into the rock. He told her about his mother, who was the clan's healer and bone reader. He told her about the indentured labor decree, an old law, invoked by a consortium of elven landowners who needed labor for the crystal quarries, technically legal, deeply cruel, and how his clan had ended up in the camp outside the city walls, and how he had been fighting in the arena for 3 years to generate the coin to buy their freedom one by one. He had been 6 purchases away when Theron's people had taken the 3 hostages. Arwen listened. She had brought no weapons tonight. She had brought no cruelty, no precisely calibrated words, no plan. She sat on the cold stone floor across from the man she had bought to destroy, and she listened to him the way she had not listened to anyone in a year. And somewhere around the 3rd hour, when the wine was half gone and his wounds were dressed, and he was telling her about the particular quality of stars seen from the Boulderfist peaks, which had more color than lowland stars because there was less atmosphere to filter them, she realized with a shock of clarity that she had stopped trying to survive her grief and had accidentally started living again. The accidental brush of her fingers against the back of his hand, reaching for the wine flask, sent a tremor through her that she categorized instantly and incorrectly as embarrassment. He looked at her hand. He did not move away. When she finally left, just before dawn, and climbed the stairs back into the cold, lovely, lying world of her manor, she stopped at the top and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. Her prisoner had become, without her permission or his, her confessor. And she had the slow, vertiginous sense that the prison she had built for him had somehow, in the night, become a door. Chapter 4, The Assassins. She had 3 days. 3 days of what she could not yet name. Of longer visits, of meals taken through the iron door together, of conversation that ranged across history and philosophy and the logistics of clan governance, and the particular loneliness of being very good at things that isolated you from other people. 3 days of a feeling she kept pressing on with careful, disbelieving fingers the way you press on a bruise to verify it's real. On the 3rd day, Sarah found her in the dungeon corridor. Her handmaiden's face was carefully controlled, but her eyes, Sarah had been in her service for 12 years and had eyes that told everything her mouth would not. Said something had gone very wrong. There are inquiries, Sarah said quietly, from Lord Cathon's people, about the Gladiator. The name landed like cold water. Lord Cathon was one of the 3 elven lords Theron had owed the largest debts to. One of the 3 who had arranged the entire duel. He would know, of course, he had always known, that Gorzid had survived the arena and passed into private hands. He had not cared immediately. A chained orc in a grieving widow's dungeon was no threat to anyone. But something had changed. Possibly the ledger. Had someone else known about it? Had one of Theron's other creditors, suspicious of the estate settlement, been digging? Arwen spent approximately 4 minutes assessing the situation. Then she went back downstairs and told Gorzid. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long?" "Hours, maybe. If they move tonight, the storm will cover them." A beat. Then, the collar. She had the key in her pocket. She had been carrying it for 2 days, which she had been very carefully not thinking about. She took it out now and unlocked the suppression collar from his neck. It fell to the floor. The enchantment on the collar had been suppressing not only his physical strength, but something else. A faint luminescence in his skin, barely visible, that flared briefly as the collar came free and then settled into a low, ember-like glow along the lines of his oldest scars. She stared. "War marks," he said, answering the unasked question. "My people burned them in after a battle survived. The magic stays." "That's useful tonight," he said. His voice had changed. Not warmer, exactly, but more present. More entirely there. She handed him the long ceremonial blade she had brought from the weapons case in the hall. He tested its weight, adjusted his grip, and handed it back to her. "Too long for inside work," he said. "What else does this house have?" What followed was 15 minutes of the strangest inventory she had ever conducted, moving through her own home with an orc she had purchased to torture while he assessed its defensive geometry with the calm, technical precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying violence as a survival craft. He noted ceiling heights, blind corners, the placement of mirrors, the weight of certain decorative pieces that could become improvised barriers. He also, in the process, moved through her house as though he had a right to be there. Which, she reflected, he now did. The assassins came just after midnight. They were good. Elven shadow trained, which meant near silent. Which meant the first warning was not a sound but the faint signature of a dispelling charm being cast on the east wall. A signature Arwen felt rather than heard. A vibration in the silver wards she'd set herself. There were 5 of them. What happened next was approximately 4 minutes of controlled chaos that Arwen would later recall in vivid, disconnected fragments. The first shadow slipping through the window and encountering not an empty corridor, but a thrown ceramic vase shattering across his face, courtesy of Gorzid's positioning instinct. Her own blade catching torchlight as she stepped from behind the heavy curtain she'd chosen as her blind. A hand closing on her wrist, not Gorzid's hand, the wrong hand, too thin, and she broke the grip with the elbow technique she'd learned 15 years ago and never used. And then the right hand, the large scarred one, was there, pulling her clear of a strike she hadn't seen coming. Back to back. It happened naturally, organically, the way things happen when 2 people have spent enough time in a room together to know each other's rhythms. She was fast and precise and trained for dueling. He was massive and strategic and trained for arenas. Where she was too light to hold a position, he anchored it. Where he had an angle he couldn't reach cleanly, she was already there. The 5th assassin was the problem. The 5th one was smart enough to hang back and wait for a gap, which a gap eventually came. When she was off balance after a deflection, and he was raising his blade with genuine professional calm. And then he was on the floor, because Gorzid had thrown a heavy iron candlestick from across the room, with a precision that should not have been possible for a man that size. The silence afterward had a particular quality. The quality of a clock stopping. They stood in the wreckage of her front hall. Her breath was ragged. His was not. Quite, though she could see the effort it cost him. The war marks along his arms were fully lit now, burning like banked coals beneath his skin. She looked at him. He looked at her. "They'll send more," he said. "I know. And when they find out those 5 didn't come back, they'll send more who are less subtle." Yes. A pause that contained, somehow, everything that had been building for a month. "I know where my clan is being held," he said. "The camp. I know the patrol schedule. I've been memorizing the guards' reports since my first week in your dungeon. I listened to them change shift when your windows were open." She stared at him. "You planned." "I waited," he said, with a precision that drew a very fine line. "I waited to know if I was waiting for an opportunity or waiting to die. Now I know." His amber eyes were steady. "Come with me or don't. But I leave before dawn." The choice sat in front of her like a cliff edge. She thought of the cold manor, the sealed portrait gallery, the ledger she had read on the floor in the dark. She went upstairs to pack. Epilogue. Before dawn. She left very little. A sealed letter to Sarah with instructions and property documentation, because Arwen had always been someone who attended to loose ends, even while fleeing. The jewels she left. They were part of another woman's story, and that woman was staying behind. She took the ledger. She took her smallest, fastest blade, and a traveling cloak, and a purse of coin, and the little portrait of her mother that she had carried everywhere since she was 7 years old. She met Gorzid in the kitchen passage at the 4th hour before dawn. He had found clothing in the servants' quarters that more or less fit, and he had the look of a man who had slept perhaps 1 hour and was perfectly fine with that. The war marks had dimmed back to their ember glow. They went out through the lower gate. Eldoria behind them, crystal and luminous in the pre-dawn dark, its spires catching the last of the stars. Ahead, the road south, toward the quarry camps, toward the mountains beyond. She matched his pace. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was a particular kind of silence that comes after decision, after the moment of choosing has passed, and what remains is simply the walk forward. And it had a quality of cleanness that she had not felt in her body for a very long time. "They'll declare you an outlaw," he said eventually. "Elven noble who freed a slave. The charges alone will be significant. I know. My people will not be easy. They will not trust you quickly, An elf who arrives with me will be seen as a trap for a long time. I know that too. A pause. You studied the route, she said. Not a question. Every night for a month. Through your window. I memorized the patrol schedules from the guard reports your steward kept in the hall cabinet. A faint thing moved through his voice that might, in another face, have been the suggestion of humor. Your household is not especially security conscious about documents. She filed that away for later. How long to reach the camp? 3 days on foot if we stay off-road. 2 if we move at night and rest in the day. We move at night, she said. The first light of actual dawn was beginning at the eastern rim of the sky, not the city lights, but the real light, slow and gray gold, spreading from the horizon the way truth spreads when you stop being afraid of it. She thought about the man she had mourned, the ghost she had been faithful to, the story she had told herself, immaculate and painful, that had turned out to be a fiction all the way down. She did not forgive Theron. She suspected she might, someday, in the particular tired way that forgiveness comes when anger has burned through all its fuel and only understanding is left. He had been a frightened man who had made monstrous choices and dressed them in the language of honor. She had loved the story of him more than she had known the truth of him. That was its own kind of grief, and it would take its own kind of time. She did not know, yet, what she and Gorzed were to each other. She knew what they had been. Captor and captive, each other's worst nightmare. 2 people ground against each other by the machinery of a dead man's deception. She knew what they had become, in the small hours of a dungeon and the chaos of an assassination attempt. Allies. Confessors. Something warm and unnamed that she was not ready to name yet, and suspected he wasn't either. She knew they were outcasts now, both of them, in all the formal ways that mattered to the world they were walking away from. And she knew, as the light grew and the road unfurled ahead of them toward uncertain territory, that she felt more genuinely alive than she had in a year. More herself. More like the person she had been before grief had crystallized her into a weapon. His hand brushed hers as they walked. Not quite an accident. She did not move away. They walked into the morning. An elf with a ledger full of secrets and a blade she was very good at using, and an orc with war marks burning quietly under his skin, and 6 members of his clan still left to free. Outcasts to both their peoples. Dangerous to every lord in the Crystal City behind them. A love story that had begun in a prison and was now being written, one step at a time, in the wide and uncharted world ahead. Is this justice? Maybe not. Maybe justice had died with Theron's ledger, and what remained was just 2 people choosing, very deliberately, a different kind of story. But as the road opened before them and the last spire of Eldoria vanished behind the tree-line, Arwen thought that choice, deliberate, costly, freely made in full knowledge of the price, might be the only justice any of them ever really get. They didn't look back. If you want more stories that walk the line between love and hate, between vengeance and grace, like this one, and subscribe. The comment section is open. Tell us, was there a moment she could have turned back? And would you have?